Isolde Merrick didn't know that the man watching her from across the Great Hall was the Alpha King of the Western Dominion. She didn't know that her father had spent 6 months arranging this visit, bartering letters and favors and promises he had no right to make. And she certainly didn't know that the quiet stranger leaning against the stone pillar near the hearth, the one with the dark ash-brown hair and the tawny eyes that caught the firelight like polished amber, had already made his decision before the first course was served. She was reading. The great hall of Merrick House was not built for reading. It was built for spectacle. Iron chandeliers hung from a vaulted ceiling blackened by centuries of hearth smoke, and the long oak tables were crowded with nobles from 3 territories. Music poured from the minstrel gallery. Laughter echoed off stone walls hung with Merrick banners, gold stags on a field of crimson, and everywhere Isolde looked there were people performing, smiling too wide, laughing too loud. Isolde had found a window seat behind a tapestry. It wasn't hiding. Not exactly. She'd learned years ago that the best way to survive her father's events was to attend just long enough to be seen and then vanish into the margins. Cordelia could have the spotlight. Cordelia was designed for it, with her golden hair pinned in elaborate curls and her rose-colored gown cut low enough to draw every eye in the room, and her laugh that rang like a bell across any conversation she chose to dominate. Isolde was not Cordelia. Isolde was the other one, the quiet one, the one their father introduced with a wave of his hand and a half-finished sentence, if he introduced her at all. She turned a page. The book was a treatise on northern border disputes, dense and dry, and she loved it the way she loved all things that asked nothing of her except attention. Books didn't care if her dress was plain. Books didn't notice that her auburn hair was twisted into a low knot instead of styled in the cascading ringlets that fashion demanded. Books didn't look through her. A shadow fell across the page. Isolde looked up, expecting a servant or, worse, her father come to scold her for disappearing. Instead, she found a man she had never seen before standing 3 feet away, one shoulder braced against the wall, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was tall, not just tall but built with the kind of broad, deliberate power that suggested his body was a weapon he'd spent years refining. His dark ash-brown hair was cropped short at the sides and left longer on top, pushed back from a face that was all sharp angles and restrained intensity. Strong jaw. High cheekbones. He wore a dark charcoal tunic with no embroidery, no house sigil, no ornamentation of any kind, and the sleeves were pushed to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with faded scars. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Tawny brown, deep and warm, like honey held up to lamplight, ringed with a darker edge that gave them a startling depth. They were fixed on her with an attention so focused, so complete, that Isolde felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. "That's Aldwich's 3rd edition," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like stone worn smooth by water but not quite all the way. "The one with the corrected maps." Isolde blinked. In her experience, men at her father's parties did not comment on academic texts. They commented on dresses and wine and the strategic value of territorial marriages. "You know Aldwich?" she asked. "I've read him." He tilted his head, and something shifted in those tawny eyes. His argument about the Thornwall Accord is flawed, though. He assumes both territories had equal bargaining power, and they didn't. "Because the Northern Territory controlled the river passage," Isolde said, before she could stop herself. "Exactly." The word landed between them like a dropped coin. Simple. Definitive. And somehow, in the way his gaze sharpened with recognition, it felt like he had just handed her something valuable. Isolde closed the book over her finger. Most people at these events don't read border dispute treaties. Most people at these events don't read anything. His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "You're Lord Merrick's daughter." It wasn't a question. She nodded anyway. "The one he doesn't talk about." That landed harder. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true, spoken with a matter-of-factness that stripped away the polite fiction she normally wrapped around her family. She kept her expression neutral. She'd had years of practice. "He has a preferred daughter for public occasions," she said evenly. "I'm the one who manages the household accounts and reads the treaties he signs without understanding them." Something flickered across his face, fast and unreadable. "And no one knows that. No one cares." He studied her for a long moment. She became suddenly, painfully aware of her plain dress, a deep plum wool with long sleeves and no adornment, practical and invisible, exactly as she intended. The ink stain on her right thumb, the fact that she was sitting in a window seat behind a tapestry at her father's most important political event of the year, reading. She waited for the dismissal, the polite excuse to return to the shining crowd and find someone more interesting. He sat down. Beside her, on the wide stone ledge, close enough that she could smell cedar and something darker, leather and smoke, and feel the warmth radiating from his body like a banked fire. He settled there as if he belonged and said, "Tell me what else your father doesn't know." Something happened in Isolde's chest, a flutter, a skip, a sensation she did not recognize and did not trust, because trusting new things was how you got hurt. She told him anyway. Maybe it was the way he listened, his whole body oriented toward her, his attention undivided. Maybe it was the way he asked real questions, the kind that peeled back layers. Or maybe it was the strange, impossible quiet that had descended the moment he sat down, as though the noise of the hall had been turned down like a lamp wick, leaving only his voice and hers and the leather and cedar scent of him. She told him about the debts her father hid behind lavish feasts, about the letters from creditors she'd found in his study, about Cordelia's engagement, arranged and rearranged 4 times, each suitor wealthier than the last. "He's selling her," Isolde said quietly, "and she doesn't even know it." The stranger's jaw tightened. "And you? What's his plan for you?" Isolde almost laughed. "I don't think he has one. I'm not valuable enough to sell." His expression shifted into something that looked almost like anger, except it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the architecture of neglect she'd described so calmly. "You're wrong," he said, low, certain. "About your value." Before Isolde could respond, the tapestry was yanked aside. Her father stood there, flushed with wine and triumph, his thinning gray hair combed back from a broad, ruddy face arranged in its most ingratiating smile. Behind him stood Cordelia, radiant in rose silk, her golden curls catching every bit of candlelight. "There you are," Harlan boomed, his pale green eyes fixing on the stranger. "Your Majesty, I've been looking everywhere. My daughter Cordelia has been so eager to meet you." "Your Majesty." The words hit Isolde like cold water. She turned to the man beside her. He hadn't moved, hadn't stood. He sat on the window ledge with the same quiet stillness, and his tawny eyes were on her father now, holding the kind of cold assessment that made Harlan's smile flicker. The Alpha King of the Western Dominion, Lysander Crane, the man whose armies had ended the border wars in a single season. That man had been sitting beside her discussing border treaties and listening to her describe her father's debts. Isolde's stomach dropped to the floor. "Your Majesty," Harlan continued, gesturing toward Cordelia, who stepped forward with a choreographed curtsy. "My eldest daughter, the jewel of Merrick House." Cordelia's light brown eyes swept over the Alpha King with exactly the right combination of shyness and interest. "It's an honor, Your Majesty." Lysander looked at Cordelia, then at Harlan. Then, without hurry, without drama, he turned and looked at Isolde. "I appreciate the offer, Lord Merrick," he said. His voice carried effortlessly. People nearby had stopped talking. "We're watching. But I've already made my choice." He lifted one hand and pointed at Isolde. "I want that one." The silence that swallowed the hall was absolute. A void that stretched from the tapestry where Isolde sat frozen with a book in her lap to the far wall where 300 guests stood with conversations dying on their tongues. Harlan's smile collapsed, rebuilt, collapsed again. Isolde? Your Majesty, surely you'd prefer Cordelia. She's far more suited to, I didn't ask for suited. Lysander's tone didn't change. Didn't need to. I said I've made my choice. He stood. The sheer presence of him, the alpha energy that rolled off his shoulders like heat from a forge, made Harlan take an involuntary step back. Lysander extended his hand toward Isolde. Palm up, steady, an offer, not an order. If you're willing, he said, his voice dropping to something only she could hear. I'd like to continue our conversation. Isolde looked at his hand. She looked at her father's stunned face, at Cordelia's stricken expression, at the 300 pairs of eyes watching from the glittering hall. She looked at the book in her lap. She put her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, the world went quiet. Not the political silence of the hall, not the held breath of the crowd, but something deeper. Something that started at the point of contact and spread outward like a ripple in still water. Every sound softened and faded until there was nothing but the feel of his hand around hers and the steady beat of her own heart and his tawny eyes looking at her as if she were the only real thing in the room. She didn't understand it. She didn't trust it. But she held on. He led her through the hall where guests parted like water before the bow of a ship, and they didn't stop until they reached the estate's inner courtyard, where the night air hit her face and the sky was vast and scattered with stars. You're the Alpha King, she said. Yes. You were sitting in my window seat, discussing border treaties. Also yes. Why? Because you were the most interesting person in that room, and I wanted to know why you were hiding behind a tapestry. I wasn't hiding. Isolde. The way he said her name stopped her cold. Not sharp. Not commanding. Reverent. You were hiding. And I want to know who taught you that you needed to. Her throat tightened. She stared at this impossible man who had chosen her over her beautiful sister in front of 300 witnesses without hesitation, and she felt something crack inside her chest, something old and calcified. My father, she said. My father taught me that. Lysander's eyes hardened, not against her. For her. A furnace, banking hotter. Then he was wrong, and I'm going to make sure he knows it. They talked until the stars shifted position. He walked her through the moonlit garden while the summit carried on without them, and they argued about the Thornwall Accord and whether Aldwich's third edition was actually better than his second. He told her about the border wars, not the version in the history books, but the version that lived in the lines around his eyes and the scars on his forearms. She told him about her mother, who had died when Isolde was 7, who had read to her every night, who had pressed a hand to Isolde's chest and said, "Your heart is a library, little one, and every person you love is a book you carry inside it." She hadn't told anyone that story in 10 years. She told him in the moonlight between 2 rose bushes, and when her voice cracked on the last word, he didn't touch her. He simply waited, close and warm and steady, until she found her way back. I should tell you something, she said. I'm not what my father will try to sell you. I'm a woman who reads too much and argues too loudly and has ink on her hands more often than not. If you're looking for an ornament, you chose the wrong daughter. I'm not looking for an ornament. Moonlight caught his eyes and turned them to liquid gold. I'm looking for someone who can tell me the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's about your own kingdom? Especially then. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him, could smell cedar and leather, could see the way his pupils had expanded in the dark until his eyes were almost black. I've had advisors and allies and people who tell me what they think I want to hear for my entire life, he said. I sat in that hall tonight and watched 300 people perform for me, and then I saw you, behind a tapestry, reading about the very border dispute I came here to resolve. You looked up at me, and you didn't perform. You just talked to me like I was a person. You are a person. You'd be surprised how few people remember that. The quiet settled between them again. That deep, impossible stillness that had everything to do with the space he created when he was near. She wanted to touch him. The thought surfaced unbidden and refused to leave. She wanted to feel that stillness again, the one that felt less like silence and more like coming home. She didn't reach for him. Not yet. It was too fast, too strange, too much for a woman who had spent her whole life believing she was the wrong choice. But she wanted to. The poisoning attempt came 3 days later. Isolde was in the library when the note arrived. Slipped under the door on parchment so thin it was nearly translucent, written in a hand she didn't recognize. He's been given ghost nettle. In the wine. 2 hours ago. Ghost nettle. She knew that plant. Rare and specific and lethal if not treated within 4 hours. It mimicked exhaustion first, then muscle weakness, then respiratory failure. A quiet death. Isolde ran. She found Lysander in the guest quarters, seated at a writing desk, one hand braced on the surface in a way that looked casual but wasn't. His face was pale, not drastically, but Isolde had spent 3 days memorizing his features, and the difference was there. A grayish tinge beneath his skin, a tightness around his mouth. "You've been poisoned," she said, shutting the door behind her. She crossed the room and took his face in both hands, checking his pupils. Dilated. Slow. Ghost nettle. In the wine. "If I don't find the antidote in the next 2 hours, your heart will stop." Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Trust. "Tell me what you need," he said. She found the ingredients in the estate's apothecary stores. Fireweed root, blackthorn bark, rendered fat from a tallow press. The combination was obscure, buried in a text so old the pages had been crumbling when she'd read it 4 years ago. But Isolde remembered. She always remembered. She boiled it over the fire in his quarters while his guard stood watch at the door with a hand on his sword. Lysander drank it without complaint. His expression when it hit his tongue confirmed what the recipe described as punishing. "This is terrible," he said. "It's saving your life. Drink all of it." He drank all of it. Then he looked at her with color already returning to his face, and that sharp focus sharpening further in his eyes. "You saved my life. I read the right book." She was shaking. She realized it distantly, the way you realize something about your body after the crisis has passed. Her hands were trembling, and her chest was tight, and there were tears pressing behind her eyes that she refused to let fall because she had not cried since she was 12 years old and her father told her that tears were a waste of his time. "Isolde." His hand found hers. The quiet descended. The room, the fire, the guard at the door, all of it faded, and there was only his warm palm against her cold, shaking fingers. "Breathe." She breathed. The trembling slowed. "I know who did this," she whispered. "Who?" "My father." She watched the words land, watched his expression go very still. "He can't marry me to you and keep the alliance he promised Lord Greymont. If you die here, he blames a rival territory and leverages the outrage into a military pact. Power without surrendering a daughter." "You figured this out just now?" "I figured it out an hour ago. I've been running the numbers while mixing your antidote." Lysander stared at her. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile. Something fiercer. "You are extraordinary." "I'm angry." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She pulled her hand free. "I want to confront him. He tried to kill you in his own house, and he would have succeeded because he didn't factor in the possibility that his invisible daughter had read enough to save the most powerful man on the continent." She was not shaking anymore. She was burning. "I want him to look at me for the first time in 20 years." Lysander held her gaze. Then he stood. Then we do it together. The confrontation happened at dinner. Harlan had arranged the evening meal as another showcase. The long table gleamed with candles and crystal goblets of wine that no one had yet touched, because Lysander's guard had quietly replaced every bottle with sealed casks from the king's own supply. Harlan didn't notice. He was too busy talking. "Your Majesty, I trust you're feeling refreshed. Cordelia has prepared a lovely—" "Lord Merrick," Isolde stood. She stood at the far end of the table where her father had seated her, as always, as far from the guest of honor as geometry allowed. She stood, and her voice carried the way she had never allowed it to before. "I need to address the table. Isolde, this isn't the time. Ghost nettle, a rare plant, fatal within 4 hours if untreated. It was dissolved in the Alpha King's wine this afternoon. I found it, identified it, and administered the antidote." The table went silent. 20 guests stared at her. Cordelia's golden face had gone white. "That's absurd," Harlan said, but his voice had changed. Tighter, higher. "You can't possibly? The residue is still in the goblet, now in the possession of the king's guard, along with the decanter from your private cellar behind a lock, to which only you hold the key." She reached into the pocket of her plum wool dress and produced a folded paper. "And this is the letter you sent to Lord Greymont 3 weeks ago, outlining a military pact contingent on the unfortunate passing of a visiting dignitary during summit season." She unfolded the letter. Her hand did not shake. "You were going to kill him," she said, looking directly into her father's pale green eyes. "And you would have succeeded, because everyone around you is too afraid to say no. But you forgot about me." Her voice dropped. "You forgot that the daughter you ignored reads everything, including your correspondence." Lysander spoke from his seat, unhurried. "Lord Merrick, you are under crown arrest for attempted regicide. Your estate is seized. Your titles suspended pending trial." The guards moved. Lysanders positioned at every exit, stepping forward with coordinated precision. Cordelia let out a gasp. Her light brown eyes were wide and wet, staring at their father as though seeing him for the first time. "Did you know?" Isolde asked quietly. "No." Cordelia's voice cracked. "Isolde, I swear." "I know. It's not your fault." The guards led Harlan from the hall. He went quietly, which surprised her. She'd expected theatrics, accusations, a final performance. But when he passed her, when he walked within arm's reach of the daughter he had overlooked for 2 decades, he stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd wanted him to her entire life. His expression was not proud, it was bewildered, as if he had opened a drawer expecting to find nothing and discovered a blade instead. Then he was gone, and the hall was quiet. And Isolde stood alone at the end of a long table full of stunned strangers and felt the burning drain out of her, leaving nothing but a hollow ache in her ribs. A hand settled on the small of her back. She knew it was him before she turned. She knew because the quiet came back. That deep, impossible stillness that swallowed every noise and left only the warmth of his palm and the sound of her own breathing. She closed her eyes and leaned into it. "You were magnificent," Lysander said, low enough for only her. "I was terrified." "Those aren't mutually exclusive either." His hand slid to her waist and turned her gently until she was facing him, and the look in his tawny eyes was so soft, so unbearably soft, that the wall inside her chest didn't crack. It dissolved. "I need you to know something," he said. "I didn't choose you to make a point. I didn't choose you because you saved my life. I chose you because you were reading behind a tapestry, and you looked up at me, and I felt the entire world go quiet." Her breath caught. "That's the bond," she whispered. "Isn't it?" "Yes." His voice was rough. "I felt it the moment I saw you, and I will wait as long as you need. I will be patient. I will not rush you or—" She kissed him. She rose on her toes, and her hands found the front of his charcoal tunic, and she pulled him down to her. And the moment their lips met, the world didn't just go quiet. It stopped. Every sound, every breath, all of it suspended, leaving nothing but warmth and pressure and the taste of him, cedar and smoke and something sweet beneath, and the feel of his hands, one on her waist and one cradling the back of her head as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. The bond blazed. Not golden, not shining, but deep. A well of silence that opened beneath them and swallowed everything that wasn't this, wasn't them. When she pulled back, his eyes were closed, his forehead dropped to hers, and his breathing was unsteady, and his hand was trembling against her hair. "You were saying something," she murmured, "about being patient." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'm revising my timeline." 2 months later, Isolde sat in the Royal Library of Crane Keep, surrounded by more books than she had ever seen in her life. The library was 3 stories tall, with spiraling staircases of dark iron and shelves that stretched to the vaulted ceiling, and every morning when she walked through the double doors and smelled ink and parchment and old leather, she had to stop and stand still, because it still didn't feel real. She was reading a first edition Aldwych, hand-annotated by the author himself, when Lysander found her. He appeared in the doorway, his dark ash-brown hair slightly damp from training, a shallow cut on his forearm that he clearly hadn't bandaged, and an expression reserved exclusively for her, soft, unhurried. The look of a man who had found the thing he didn't know he was searching for. "You missed the council session," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Your Treasury Minister's proposal was mathematically indefensible. I wrote a counter-analysis." She nodded toward the stack of papers on the desk. "Page 4 has the corrected projections." He picked up the papers. His eyebrows rose. "You restructured the entire territorial tax framework. It needed restructuring. In one morning. I had 3 hours. I was being thorough." He set the papers down and crossed to her, and when he leaned over the back of her chair and pressed his mouth to her temple, the world went quiet. That beautiful, bottomless silence that she had learned was not the absence of sound, but the presence of belonging, of being known, of being chosen, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. By a man who had walked into a room full of glittering strangers and found the woman reading in the corner and decided, in that first steady moment, that she was the one. "I love you," he said against her hair. She turned her head and caught his mouth with hers, soft and brief and full of warmth. "I know. It's in the data." He laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she was still learning to coax from him. She collected those laughs, stored them the way she stored quotes from books. "Your sister wrote again," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "She wants to visit." I said yes. Isolde closed the Aldwych text over her finger and looked at him. "She's my sister. She's learning. And people deserve the chance to see clearly, even if it takes them longer than it should." "You're talking about more than Cordelia." "I'm talking about everyone, including me. You saw me clearly before I could see myself. I'm still catching up." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. The quiet came down around them like a curtain, and in it, she could feel his heartbeat through his palm. Steady. Strong. Hers. "Take your time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside the library windows, autumn sunlight fell in long gold bars across the floor, and the books rose around them like walls of a different kind, not the kind that kept you hidden, but the kind that held the whole world inside them, waiting to be opened. Somewhere below, she could hear the distant sound of the keep coming alive, boots on stone, voices carrying across the courtyard, the rhythm of a kingdom that had somehow, impossibly, become hers too. Isolde turned the page.